On the peninsula of Mount Athos in northern Greece, there are 20 Orthodox monasteries and the ruins of dozens more. Tradition says that once, long ago, the Virgin Mary was on a sea voyage with John the Evangelist. A storm kicked up, they were blown off course, and they landed there. Mary was so struck by the beauty of Mount Athos, the legend says she asked her son in heaven to make the area into her personal garden, a place for preserving otherworldly beauty and wisdom on earth. The 20 monasteries of Mount Athos today hold one of the world's largest, possibly the largest, it's never been fully cataloged, collections of sacred manuscripts, icons, and artwork. Much of it is incredibly ancient. The peninsula has been raided and devastated many times over the last 2,000 years, but the monks have always returned, bringing their sacred treasures out of hiding when the coast was clear. There is, sadly, no historical evidence for this legend. No proof that Mary or John ever came within 100 miles of Mount Athos. The tradition is not well sourced in the earliest centuries, and yet here the monks live, tending Mary's garden, generation after generation. Above the doorway of one of these monasteries, there is an ancient inscription. If you die before you die, when you die, you won't die. I bring up the lack of historical evidence because, honestly, I have a hard time not bringing it up. At heart, I'm afraid I've always been something of a skeptic. There is no supernatural claim or miraculous legend which I approach without great caution, if not immediate quiet dismissal. I would never tell someone else that they need to follow my practice in this area, but it seems to be hardwired into me. I'm not quite sure who I would be without that instinct. It's been suggested that I may come by this downer disposition via my Scandinavian roots. My grandfather was a Swedish immigrant, and I've long been interested in understanding my heritage. And it turns out, if you go back about 1,000 years and you look at the myths which my ancestors told around their winter campfires, you don't exactly come away with the impression of a super trusting and hopeful people. An example, in Norse myth, we encounter all sorts of amazing gods and goddesses. Folks like Odin, Thor, Loki, Freya, Sif, and Heimdall. You find dwarves, giants, and trolls. All of them live in worlds that are scattered amongst the branches of a cosmic world tree, and there are bridges that allow one to pass from world to world. Down at the roots of this world tree, you find a dragon, a massive dragon. It's called the Nidhogg, and in Norse myth, it is believed to be the devourer of the dead. Essentially, whenever somebody dies and is buried, their essence goes down into the underworld and is eventually consumed by the Nidhogg. Worse still, the Nidhogg gnaws at the roots of the world tree, and one day Norse myth claims he will bring it down, triggering the final battle between gods and monsters, the Ragnarok. In these Norse myths, virtually everyone dies in the Ragnarok. The gods, the giants, the dwarves, the trolls, all of them. All except the Nidhogg. The dragon of death seems to be largely what remains in the end, feasting on the souls of every living thing that ever existed. In the end, nothing escapes death. That is the happy ending my ancestors recited as they sat around their winter fires, drinking heavily, one assumes, keeping an ear out for wolves, and hoping that the food stores might somehow last until spring. Spring, which brings us to Easter. Today is the feast of the resurrection, the day we celebrate the defeat of death and the victory of Christ. My pagan ancestors would probably be shocked by the idea. But then again, my pagan ancestors eventually converted to Christianity. With the passing of generations, they seem to have found great meaning in the resurrection. What is it about the resurrection which has made it so persuasive to so many people over the centuries? Why find hope in this story of an obscure Jewish prophet who returns from the grave? I mean, it can't simply be belief in the literal event. If a dead person returned to life tomorrow, let's say in New Zealand, do you really suppose it would remain front page news 2 months later? It would still be discussed, no doubt. There would still be stories popping up here and there on the internet as folks struggled to understand it. A Netflix docuseries would probably be in the works. But the world would move on. Eventually, the New Zealand resurrection would simply be an eccentric footnote in the trivia of human history. Yet the resurrection of Christ, the Christian story of Jesus returning from the dead, it changed the world. People can disagree on how they assess that change, for better or for worse. But no one can say the resurrection didn't land like a thunderbolt in human history, altering everything which came after. Why? I've worked full-time in the church for about a decade now. First as a youth director, then as a young adult missioner, more recently as a deacon and hospital chaplain. Over that time, I have met a lot of people, young and old, who are pretty sure they know exactly why the resurrection matters to Christians. It's about knowing where you go when you die, they explain. Again and again, I have encountered folks ranging from devoted Christians to militant atheists who are certain that this is the dividing line, the thing which makes someone a real Christian or even a real religious person. The ability to confidently affirm a particular scenario about the afterlife. There may be some interesting ideas in Christianity about love of neighbor or justice or mercy or the life of Jesus, but at the end of the day, what it all boils down to, they tell me, is you either believe in an afterlife or you don't. And that is the fork in the road for being religious or not. This has been a very awkward fork in the road for me to discuss with people because, like I said before, I'm kind of a skeptic at heart. If it's our ability to affirm the afterlife without hesitation, which makes us Christian, which makes us believers in the resurrection, then I guess I'm in big trouble. Yet maybe there is some hope for me. Remember the inscription from Mount Athos. If you die before you die, when you die, you won't die. This inscription is clearly an affirmation of the resurrection. Yet it seems to suggest that our encounter with the resurrection starts somewhere before we reach the grave. Die before you die. I may have my doubts about what comes after my death, but the Athos inscription points to something I don't need to wait around to experience. As Christians, we may recognize this cryptic saying as an ancient reference to baptism. Going down into the water is a kind of death and burial. In those waters, Christians die to the idea that their life is fundamentally about themselves. And then we come back up from the water. That other half of baptism is the resurrection. We are reborn as something new, something bigger, something which cannot die. Our lives become an extension of the life of God, and you just can't kill God. The Christian God is entirely Ragnarok-proof. Skeptical me can actually get behind this idea of joining my life to God. It sounds challenging, but also weirdly reflective of my actual lived experience of the Christian faith. The moments in my life which have been most meaningful, those moments when I most clearly felt that I was spending my life wisely, these have reliably been moments focused on something far greater than simple self-interest. In dying to myself, I found there was somehow more of me, not less. I can actually experience this form of the resurrection, whatever I think on any given day about the afterlife. If you die before you die, when you die, you won't die. And there may be even more signs of hope for my skeptical heart. Take, for instance, the Bible's stubborn refusal to give a singular, clear account of the resurrection. One gospel story says the risen Christ can't be touched and appears and disappears like a ghost. Another story says he asks to be touched and will actually split a fish dinner with you. Another story says you find the risen Christ within the stranger, within a shared meal, within one another. And then St. Paul goes and says that he's actually more like a blinding light and a voice. So what gives? Which vision of the afterlife am I supposed to be confidently affirming in order to earn my real official Christian membership card? The problem with pinning faith in the resurrection to a simple up-down vote on an afterlife hypothesis is that it ignores what the Bible and countless Christians from ancient times down to the present have actually insisted upon. The resurrection is a mystery. It's actually what the Greeks called a mysterion. A mysterion is not the kind of mystery that we associate today with Agatha Christie or Scooby-Doo. There is no point at which one solves it. A mysterion is a religious idea with bottomless meaning. Every time you think you have gotten to the root of it, you break through and you find there is another sub-basement you didn't know about. It just keeps on going, growing deeper and more complex the longer you wrestle with it. But if you can't solve it, if you can't pin it down and say precisely what the resurrection means, then what good is it? I mean, at that point, is it simply just empty words? The point of a sacred mystery is not to arrive at a finish line. It's instead about keeping you moving in a certain direction. While you are digging through all of these sub-basements of meaning, you are not standing still. You're on a journey. So the question then becomes, what direction does faith in the resurrection call us to go? In today's gospel reading, Jesus gives us a pretty clear answer. North, go to Galilee. To recap our gospel, Jesus tells the angel to tell the Marys to tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee. And then, seemingly worried that the angel may have forgotten, Jesus turns up personally to make sure this message is received. Tell my followers to find me in Galilee. If we can figure out why the risen Jesus is so keen to get people to Galilee, we may learn something critical about the resurrection. So, what's the deal with Galilee? Why doesn't Jesus meet his followers in Jerusalem, or Bethlehem, or Rome, or that hip new falafel place down by the river? In the first century Roman Empire, the entire province of Judea, the former kingdom of Israel, now annexed by Rome, the setting of the Gospels, this was considered a backwater. History of the era is filled with Roman officers who are punished by being sent to a post in Judea. And within Judea, the northern region of Galilee was considered the backwater of the backwater, an uncultured and impoverished region where people smell and talk funny. Saying that someone spoke like a Galilean could be considered an insult in Jerusalem in Jesus' time. This is where Jesus tells his disciples to go, Galilee. What's the modern equivalent? As a guy with Appalachian roots, that is the non-Swedish part of my heritage, I tend to think of West Virginia, or the hollers of Kentucky, places filled with rednecks, rotting barns, abandoned gas stations, and opioid addiction, places filled with death. You may picture somewhere else. Just fill in any place or group of people that it is still socially acceptable to mock, and you've probably got it. That's Galilee. That is where we are told to go if we want to encounter the risen Christ. So what happens to Jesus' disciples when they get there? Unfortunately, our lectionary, the schedule of readings that we use in church each Sunday, is about to take a massive sidetrack over into the Gospel of John, beginning next week. We won't come back to Matthew's Gospel and continue this story until June 4th. And by then, we will have probably forgotten what was going on and lost the narrative thread. So let me jump ahead and spoil it for you. Here is how the story continues in Matthew 28, 16 to 20. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." The disciples meet Jesus on a mountain in Galilee, and he sends them out to baptize people, to build the church, and to proclaim the gospel. But you may have missed 3 critical words in there. So let me repeat a crucial sentence. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Some doubted. They have the risen Jesus standing right there in front of them, and some of them still aren't sure about all this. But they worship, and then they are sent forth to build the church. Jesus builds his church with doubters, with skeptics, with people like me, like us. It turns out that having certainty about the afterlife is not the point of the resurrection. We can be unsure. We can debate what happens after we die endlessly, maybe even profitably, but it doesn't make us any more or less Christian. The thing which makes our lives Christian is that we trust Jesus enough to go where he told us to go, towards the places where death says all hope is lost. Jesus tells us, go there and tell death it does not get the last word. Death never gets the last word. That is what it means to spread the good news. That's what it means to affirm that Christ has defeated death. The Christian life is not an exercise in hypothetical ideas about the future. It's about how we live our lives right now in a certain direction. That is what it means to die and rise with Christ in baptism. Die to a life lived out of self-interest. Die to a life lived in cynicism or apathy or despair. Join your life to Christ. Become his hands and feet in this world. Bring hope and joy and life to a world that badly needs it. That kind of life, that kind of love will endure. I'm a skeptic at heart. I will go to my grave with absolutely no certainty about what happens to me next. I guess God can surprise me. The resurrection doesn't give me any guarantees about this stuff, just images to keep my doubting heart on the path of hope. My ancestors in Scandinavia, by the way, eventually built churches. And one of the oldest of these, which still stands today, there is a wooden cross hung above the altar. At the foot of this cross, this world tree, you can find the Nidhogg, the dragon of death. Jesus is standing in his jaws, wrenching the monster's fangs apart and pulling the dead from his belly. Alleluia, Christ is risen. Death is defeated. If you die before you die, when you die, you won't die. Happy Easter.